very committed to putting pressure on BC to come around and focus on what this pipeline actually means.
Well, sometimes the nastiest fights are the family fights, and the pipeline fight between the NDP Premier of BC and the NDP Premier of Alberta is getting nastier by the day. Despite a combined effort from the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and some of the provinces to intercede with financial assurances that the pipeline will get built, BC Premier Horgan says, no way, and he'll be taking his case to court next month. Meantime, Alberta and Saskatchewan are making plans to cut off oil to British Columbia if Horgan doesn't back down. With so much tension and uncertainty, Kinder Morgan says the project may still be untenable. So if financial backing is not enough, what's the solution? Let's bring in the Scrum. Tonda McCharles is a reporter with the Toronto Star. Bob Fife is the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief. Craig Oliver is CTV's chief political commentator. Our special guest today is NDP leader Jagmeet Singh in Vancouver. Mr. Singh, I got to start with you. You're federal NDP leader. Why haven't you met with Premier Horgan and Premier Notley together to try to mediate this inter-party dispute?
Well, our teams have been in constant communication. My chief of staff has been in constant communication with both Premier Notley and Premier Horgan's teams. Really, we've got to underline that there's a lot at stake here. This is a question about jobs, about the economy, it's about the environment, it's about First Nations. So there's a lot at stake. And at the end of the day, everyone on this panel, all experts know this is going to be resolved in court. We've done this before. There's been questions of a serious nature which have required the Supreme Court to weigh in on. It's going to end up there anyways. I proposed a way forward which would actually allow for all partners to come together, BC, Alberta, First Nations. Everyone comes together with the federal government with a joint reference question to the Supreme Court, and then we get an answer. Okay, this would expedite matters. This would be a way to move forward together.
Now, you know Rachel Notley has called you irrelevant because she thinks you've already made your choice, that under any circumstances you don't support this pipeline. If the court comes back and says this is in federal jurisdiction, just plain and simple, Mr. Singh, would you support the pipeline under that circumstance, yes or no?
Well, listen, I've made my opposition very clear to the project already, but that's not relevant in the sense that there's a way to move forward. Even if I don't agree with the project, I still want to see our country come together. And I absolutely, as a lawyer, support the rule of law and would support or would accept a decision by the Supreme Court. Absolutely, without question. That's why we've got this institution that we put questions to. We've dealt with major questions like same-sex marriage and questions around how a province can separate and things like Senate reform. These are major questions that we put to a reference question.
Mr. Singh's problem here, I would say that Mr. Singh's problem here is, even though whether he was here or not, is that he's got a horse in both races, and he can't make up his mind which horse he wants to be on, so he's trying to cover it by talking about other things and other people. But he cannot say, does he approve of that pipeline? Does he believe the national interest is in that pipeline or not?
Well, I heard him right. He said if the courts rule the pipeline's okay.
I've said it a number of times.
But that won't end it.
Okay, go ahead. Just clarify that, Mr. Singh, and then I'll get Bob Fife.
No, I just want to make it clear. I've made my opposition very clear, but the point here is how do we move ahead? There's all sorts of disagreement. BC is putting a reference question to the Court of Appeal because they've got concerns around their legitimate concerns around protecting the environment and defending the coastline. Alberta has a legitimate concern around not wanting to be able to use the resources that they have as a province. First Nations have a legitimate
let me just bring in Bob Fife.
Being respected.
Bob.
Well, listen, if I heard the NDP leader right, if the courts rule that the pipeline is legitimate, then the NDP would support that. I'm not sure that his supporters would agree with that position, but he's on the record now saying that. But the problem you have here, and the federal government does not want to go down this road, that a court decision would take at least 12 to 18 months. They've got a timeline here with a major corporation saying we're going to get out of here. And so they can talk about courts all they want. Eventually that may be the end of the matter. But this pipeline, if the government is to be believed that they're going to make this thing happen, then they're going to buy into it. And they're going to see this pipeline get made.
See, as much as I appreciate Mr. Singh, that you're a lawyer, and as much as I love covering the Supreme Court of Canada, in all the previous references we've seen go to the Supreme Court, not only do they take a long time, there are legitimate arguments on all sides of these things. Really, though, I don't think we should be leaving it to the judges to decide what demand political solutions in this federation. I really think that the fact that you want to kick it to the court and not pronounce the way you see the path forward, I think that's a failure of your ability to make a policy decision in the national interest. And I think that that's what the government also ought to be doing. I think that these premiers ought to be finding political solutions and not looking for judicial solutions.
Okay, Bob, let me just...
Well, Tonda, I mean, the reality is that it's being
Singh.
brought forward as a reference question to the Court of Appeal in BC. If that gets appealed, which it may, it will end up in the Supreme Court anyway.
It may well.
We all know that jurisdictional questions, questions that are very legitimate about jurisdiction, can only be solved in the Supreme Court. They are not decisions that can be made politically. These are questions of, does a province have the right to put forward interests and concerns around the environment, given a process that actually was completely absent of scientific evidence and expert testimony.
Okay,
but in fact, you know that the Federal Court of Appeal is already actually looking at the overall decision to approve that pipeline by the NEB and by the federal government. There will be a decision on whether this project met all its constitutional requirements of consultation, duty to consult with First Nations, and everything else. So I think we're actually going to get an answer to some of these questions pretty quickly.
Okay, let me just, the other aspect, and we had Bill Morneau on here. And the question here is, has the federal government done enough from their side to, as Justin Trudeau reiterates again and again, quote, get this pipeline built?
I was interested that he said to you, the finance minister, that he couldn't begin to give you a timeline, a date when this pipeline might be finished, which tells me that a lot of this may be irrelevant in the sense that when the next election comes, we still may be fighting the same arguments about the pipeline. And as for the Supreme Court, I would hope that the leader of the national party, like the NDP, should decide on his own whether something is in the national interest without being told by the Supreme Court whether it is or not.
Bob.
You know, the issue here to me is we're losing $40 billion a year of revenue because we're not getting world price. That is money that could go to help poor people, it could go to our healthcare system, go to all kinds of very job creation measures. And I don't understand why people don't see that a pipeline, which, by the way, we're shipping our stuff by more dangerous routes by rail right now, why a pipeline could not improve the standard of living.
But has the federal government, Bob, done enough?
No, they haven't done enough. They've said they have never been out there making the case that this pipeline was valuable on these kind of conditions until the oil company put a knife to their throat.
Right. Now, Tonda, and Andrew Weaver was on this program, and he said that any attempt by the federal government to pony up money for this and some kind of backstop, and he called it corporate welfare on steroids, and he thinks the public will not buy it. What do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting because we've been seeing some polls coming out around that decision of should the feds invest in it or not, and Canadians don't seem to be that much in favor of it right now, but it seems as the weeks go by, public opinion is actually shifting in favor of the pipeline development proceeding. So that's going to be a dance for the federal government. I actually do think that there is a question, though, around why the federal government does have to step in and subsidize that piece.
Jagmeet Singh, this could get ugly. Again, there might be big protests on this. You wanted to comment on this. Where does this go if this becomes, I mean, there are going to be questions about you if you would stand in front there and like Elizabeth May, get arrested and protest this thing. What would you do in that situation?
Well, I think it's important for us to look at the question of financing. I mean, we've got a lot of issues that we need to deal with as a nation. We've got boil water advisories in so many First Nation reserves. We've got issues around seniors who are cutting their pills in half because they can't afford medication, so pharmacare is a big question. We've got an affordable housing crisis across the country, which is something that needs immediate attention. So given all these dire needs that we have as a nation, does public financing, does putting our taxpayer dollars towards this project at a time when the federal government has promised to and their subsidies to fossil fuels. Does it really make sense? Does it really fit within our national
cash
priorities?
cow.
I think those
It
are
could be a
legitimate
cash
questions.
cow, this pipeline. I mean,
Oh,
this is
okay,
a
but
Well,
pipeline
look,
the
if
government
actually,
can make money on.
if Bob is right on the $40 billion in projected revenue that could come in, that could pay for a guaranteed annual income. That's a $43 billion
Right.
price tag. Pharmacare could pay for a pharmacare program 10 times over. So
just last question, because I got 30 seconds, Mr. Singh. Can I just get an answer to that question? There will be
What's the
protests, and I just am wondering, would you stand in front, be part of a protest, risking, like Elizabeth May, getting arrested at some point? Would you be part of a protest against that pipeline?
Well, as a new Democratic leader, I'm proud of defending the environment, so I would obviously continue to advance the concerns around coastal impact and marine wildlife impact, the impact of a diluted bitumen oil spill, and talk about how these are very important issues. You know, this government promised to be defenders of the environment, and they're not defending the environment. I want to be a defender of the environment.
So you would, I'm trying to get the answer, sir.
Not an
Come on,
answer.
give us an
Hold
answer.
on, give us an
All right,
answer.
hang on, let's hear him. Would you be part of a protest if that pipeline is getting built, sir?
Well, my role as a federal leader would be to raise the issue in the way that the manners that I have as a federal leader, which is to talk about them on these type of platforms, to raise the issues wherever I can. That I'll use my tools as a federal leader to raise the issues.
All right, great to have you on the Scrum. Jagmeet Singh, leader of the NDP, sir, thank you so much. Really important issues, and I really appreciate your contribution on that.